Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to do a little talk, if I may, on the speed of early recordings. It's a problem. Today we think of old records, and many times we call them old 78s. And old 78s are what we think of, when we think of records. We think of a 78 record. Well, I'm here to let you know that, especially in the earliest days of recording, 78 was more of an idea, more of a concept than a reality. In fact, most records weren't anywhere near 78 RPMs. You go to the early days. For those of you who know early recordings, you have Berliner, and Berliner, of course, averaged somewhere between 65 and about 75 RPMs. Varied. It depended on what was being recorded, who was recording, and how long the record needed to be. There was no set speed. Some of the early zonal phones and, of course, Climax records, which are the early Columbias, are recorded at speeds, once again, somewhere between 65 and about 75 RPMs. There's no set rule. One would think that once the standardized companies came into existence, such as the Victor Talking Machine Company and the Columbia Graphophone Company, that there would be a standardized speed. Now, Columbia's speed supposedly always was 80 RPMs. Well, once again, that's what they said, but it wasn't always a fact. There's a far wider range on Victor Records. It runs the gamut. It runs everywhere from around 69 RPMs all the way up to about 83. Um, Depending on who was recording, depending why the recording was done the way it was, it's hard to say. Now, that's not always true with some of the early gramophone and typewriter recordings, which were done in Europe. Case in point, the voice of Enrico Caruso. In his earliest recordings, recorded in Milan, the speed is about 67 RPMs, which is far below that standardized 78. Also, you have Tamagno, the famous tenor, famous for creating the role of Otello, and his recordings are somewhere around 71 to about 73. Same may be said for Patti, her recordings. And when they're played at 78, all of these recordings sound wrong. They sound bizarre. They don't sound correct. And for many of us, we grew up thinking that some of these singers actually sounded like they did at 78 RPM. Who would have known? The first time I ever heard a recording of Tamagno, it was on a set by RCA. And of course, there again, as I said, his recordings are about 71. And also, the other thing is, being that he was up in years, he had retired, he had a bad heart, he pitched everything down. Now, when they decided to reissue these recordings in the 1950s and 60s, they went to the original pitch of the piece, which was not what it was recorded at. So the end result was this shrieking voice comes across singing. And I used to hear that and say, who would like this guy? He sounds terrible. Well, nonetheless, he was being played at the wrong speed. And when you start playing a record just a few revolutions off from where it was recorded, it starts sounding very strange. So this is the important thing to know. Edison records, okay, the cylinders, once they're standardized, right around 1900, 1901, the speed is 160 RPMs. It stays that way. It's pretty standard, although there are fluctuations there too in the speed. On the diamond disc, it's 80 RPMs usually. However, there are also fluctuations. The greatest change and the greatest difficult part is the early years, let's just say from 1895 to about 1910, we really have a heavy fluctuation of speeds. It improved somewhat in the 1910 to 1920 period, but that doesn't mean it's done correctly. It seems that the average speed for Victor Records, starting around 1910, 1911, seems to be about 75 RPMs. Most of Caruso's recordings are 75 to 76 RPMs. There were many recording artists that recorded at certain speeds because that's what the recording engineers thought made sense. So the end result is, if you have old 78s, that's wonderful. And after about 1925 to about 1927, everything was standardized due to electrical recording and electrical reproduction, and the speed was pretty well set at 78.26. And that's great. But the period from around of disc records or cylinders, let's just go all the way back to its dawn in the late 1880s, all the way up to about 1925, is a very, very varied and mixed lot of speeds. And so old 78s, old 160s, old 80s aren't always exactly what they appear. So do learn about the records that you have, that the artist, find out if they recorded everything on pitch. If they didn't, you'll find a vast difference if you do put it in pitch. So, well, closing up here on another little talk on recording. Uh, Pleasure to join you for a while, and I'm sure I'll be babbling about something else very soon.